Every night the prairie carried a voice across the grass, once a jagged warning on wind, then a thin thread of song that found its way under Daniel Reed's ribs. He would wake to it as if memory had a sound, as if the land itself had learned to speak her name. Sometimes the voice was a single-breathed vowel, the remnant of a word. Sometimes it was a laugh that shivered the long grass. He could not tell the difference at first between what the wind borrowed from memory and what his own want had made true. He had found her at the bottom of a canyon where the red rock sloped into shadow and the late sun had left the air thick with dust. She lay half-turned against a boulder, one hand clenched into the earth, hair matted with grit. Her coat was torn. A smear of dried blood tracked from temple to jaw. She did not cry out when he knelt. Her eyes opened on him like someone deciding whether to live. Daniel had a slow way about him. He stooped and checked the broken places without hurry, because there was no hurry he could give that would change what had been done. He wrapped her in his blanket and lifted her like another weight of the land. The canyon rock bit at his boots. Loose gravel slid under his heels. He expected to hear the sound of men behind him, shouts, the clack of boots, and he expected nothing else. There had been nothing else for a long while on his stretch of prairie but the work of keeping a house and the regular ache of loneliness. When he got her to the cabin and laid her on his pallet, she stared at the rafters for a while, the slow rise and fall of the logs swallowing the noise of the prairie. He brought water in a tin cup and set it on the stool, then waited outside the circle of light she made with her breath. He did not touch her hair. He did not ask 100 questions he could not answer. He tended the cuts and bound a hand with a strip torn from his own shirt. He watched the way her shoulders did not let themselves go. She was lean, weather tough, not broken. She moved like someone who had known how to survive without asking permission, and the thing Daniel felt first, with the bluntness of a man used to few surprises, was that this woman in his doorway belonged nowhere particular that he could offer. So he made a small thing instead, a safe night. Stay with this story to see why a single night changed 2 lives. Days at the cabin unspooled in the thin rituals of living. Pine smoke draped the loft each morning and stained the air with a sharp, clear smell. Daniel rose with the light, tended a stubborn pot on the stove, set a tin cup for coffee, watched the kettle sing, then carried a bowl of stew to the table. Nayeli watched him the way someone mapping a new route watches the stars. She accepted the food without thanks. Her hands were steady as she ate. She slept with one eye nearly open for the first week, fingers curled around the hem of the blanket as if afraid the world might slip away. She did not speak English well, only shards of it. A word here, a gesture there. Daniel moved toward things he could do. He left a chair by the window with a blanket over it so she could sit in the light and mend what needed mending. He nailed a place on the wall for her moccasins. He set a small basin where she could wash. He handled the rifle on the peg above the mantel the way he handled everything he trusted, with attention and without show. He did not press her for stories. He left her to pick at the edges of whatever memory came loose. From Nayeli's point of view, everything had gone to a hard place, and then stillness. The raid had been something that cut through the night like a blade, a scattering of fire, the thunder of horses, the smell of smoke that clung to the throat. That memory had sharpened into a line she could trace in the dark, where she'd fallen, the way the world tilted, how the canyon took the sound of men and gave it back hollow. The rancher who found her had been a stranger with a careful light in his hand. He had not asked her to forgive what she had left behind. He had only put a blanket around her shoulders and moved her inside his small house. In that way, his mercy was a thing without words, and she measured it with the slow arithmetic of need: water, food, shelter. She watched him for the small steadiness of his hands. The first weeks were a study in boundaries. Daniel announced himself at the cabin door when he came in from tending the animals because his upbringing had taught a kind of respect. He left her supplies where she could reach them, never crowding the space she had. Nayeli tended her own wound. She laundered the blood from the hem of her coat, stitched the tear with thread pulled from a spare shirt. She boiled juniper and rinsed the jagged edges of the cut until it stopped looking like violence and only looked like a place on the body that had been mended. She kept watch at night, too, placing her back against the cabin wall and listening with the same soldierly attention she used in the day. When she hummed low, the sound unspooled into the rafters, and Daniel felt it the way men feel thunder from a far storm, an incoming weather, something that would alter the night. There was an awkward shape to their companionship at first. Conversation was a series of small, practical exchanges, a trade of language for labor. He taught her how to bake bread in his iron pan. She taught him to tie a particular knot that held better against prairie wind. He learned the angle of her jaw when she refused to be questioned, and the tilt of her head when she chose to answer. There was no drama in it. There was only the slow undoing of solitude, but the world beyond the cabin noticed. News slips like dry grass. A woman of Apache blood seen on a man's property. The sighting of a stranger's blanket at neighbor's fence. Daniel began to sense a tightening when he rode into town. Men walked with shorter steps around him. Conversations fell away when he entered the mercantile. The grocer watched him with an expression that mixed suspicion with the calculation that came from people whose world was measured in gossip and grain. Once at the bar, a man muttered something about harboring one of them, and Daniel answered with a low rim of warning that did nothing to cool the murmur. It was 3 men who took the decision into their own hands. They came at dusk, the sky a slab of iron, horses throwing up sparks of dust as they halted at his fence. They were known names in town, men who did not have patience for the slow diplomacy of law. They came with the kind of certainty that breeds in corners where fists and talk are the same currency. They banged on the door until the cabin shuddered. The sound woke Nayeli. She rose and stood with her shoulder to the doorway, eyes catching the dark beyond like someone calculating distance. Daniel moved in front of her because that was what his stubbornness allowed, the small, blunt belief that his house was his to defend. The men demanded she come out. They said nothing of any papers. Their voices were a kind of hunger made human. Demand clothed as right. "She's on my place," Daniel said. His voice was low and steady. "She stays." One of the riders spat on the threshold. "You can't keep her. She's not welcome around here." Nayeli moved then, not as a shadow, not as a thing to be seized, but as a person making a choice. She took the rifle that hung above the hearth. Her fingers closed around the wood with familiarity. She stepped forward into the doorway and raised the barrel to shoulder level. It was the simple geometry of a woman who had been trained by necessity. No wasted motion, no theatrics. The rifle coughed once over the prairie, a report that tore at the quiet like a fist. The bullet did not find a body. It slammed into the ground between the men and the cabin, a stone-throwing command. The riders halted. One hand slipped to his holster. They had expected a cringing figure, a simple retrieval. They had not expected a person who would shoot to warn. And in that shot, there was a statement that snapped across the space between them. "You will not take me without paying a cost." "Back off!" Nayeli said in uneven English. Her voice was iron under silk. She did not lower the rifle. "Not today." Daniel stepped further in front of her, place and choice belonging to both of them. "Leave," he told the men. "Go home." Something softened behind the bravado of the riders, a calculation where theft of a life had intersected with the risk of blood. They retreated a pace, but not wholly. One of them spat again and turned his horse. They rode away into the night, the sound of their horses a hollow echo that dulled at last. After, the cabin breathed like a living thing. Nayeli lowered the rifle and leaned the butt against the table. She did not look at Daniel as if seeking gratitude. She looked as if she had closed a door on an old fear. Word travels faster than law in places like that. The next morning, mounted men in dull-seamed uniforms came rattling up the lane. They were representatives of a distant authority. A captain, 2 soldiers, a clerk with papers that rustled like dried leaves. The captain's jaw was square. He had the look of men who had never seen the prairie at night as anything but a map to be owned. "We've had complaints," the captain said, sliding the papers across the table like a challenge. He read names and numbers and regulations in a voice that made each line sound like a lashing. He spoke of orders and the strange presumptions that could embroil a rancher in trouble if he persisted in harboring someone considered outside the law of white settlement. Daniel listened and felt an old, slow dread rise in his throat. The law here had many teeth and few mercy gums. The captain's final words were not a question. She must be returned. Daniel put his hand flat on the papers. He was a small man for the decision he had made that day, but his hand was steady. She's not being returned anywhere, he said. He felt the sound of his own voice like a weight throwing him into a different kind of weather. You're putting yourself at risk, the captain said. You cannot claim people. I claim her, Daniel said, and the words landed awkwardly, the air around them shifting. It felt like a gamble lobbied on a table where the stakes were not only his livelihood, but something about honor he could not watch disintegrate. He said it again, more quietly. She's my wife. The captain barked a laugh that did not sound like a laugh. You can't just... But the paper clerk was lawful and precise. He asked the formal questions. He wrote names down. He said the word marriage in a tone that made it sound like a ledger entry. He demanded proof. Daniel had none to offer. No minister, no license, no ceremony. He had only the thing he had offered days ago, shelter. And the woman beside him who had survived what she'd survived and who had the right to choose. Nayeli studied the men. She watched the way they needed the law to be a net to catch them, the way their eyes slid from document to document and never really landed on her. She understood their hunger to put people into boxes, but she had no trust that any of those boxes would keep her safe. So she stepped into the small theater with a kind of quiet fury and placed her voice where it could be heard. If you mean to take me back to a place that hunts me, she said, voice thin but steady, I will not go. The captain fumbled with his words. He offered warnings and potential consequences. Daniel felt a hand in the back of his neck as if the world had compressed to a single hinge and was waiting to see which way they would swing. Nayeli reached out, took Daniel's rough hand in her own, just long enough for the warmth to say what nothing else would. She said in a plain, careful way, Then we are married. It was not a surrender. It was not a plea. It was a deliberate choice, a refusal to be returned to the night as an object of pursuit, a refusal to let the men make her life a commodity. In the small room with the captain's papers and the smell of coffee gone cold on the table, something like a new law held. The captain could do his formalities and write his scrawl and make his threats. He could not unmake the fact that she had chosen this man at his table and that he had chosen her. The soldiers left with the kind of irritation that is often the final face of authority when it meets an unwilling thing. They muttered. The clerk shook his head and tucked his papers away. The captain's parting words were a warning. They were not a peace. But the immediate danger ebbed. The town had been given a fact to reconcile with its outrage. The two of them had said in public that they were bound. After that, the work of living resumed, altered at its seams. There was no wedding in any proper sense, no preacher, no ring, no ceremonial vows. Once the captain was gone and the last horse had churned the lane, they sat across from each other with a pot of stew between them and the sun lying like a bruise on the horizon. Quietly, as if testing the evenness of the moment, Nayeli reached for the empty cup and set it near Daniel's hand. He took it and drank. There was no need for more words. Their days were stitched together by small intimacies that were not spoken about as intimacy, but stitched themselves into the fabric of the house. She learned how to mend a wound so it would scar less raggedly. He learned the precise angle to hold a loaf so it browned evenly. They shared the work of the animal pens. They moved through storms and heat alike, making mundane decisions that, taken at scale, became the architecture of a life. Once, near dusk, when the sky had the color of old pewter, Daniel found her sitting on the low fence, the rifle across her knees, watching the prairie with a look that could have been calm or it could have been vigilance. He sat beside her, not touching, and folded his hands over his hat. At night, the voice that had first been a thread of memory became presence. Sometimes it was the sound of her speaking to herself as she repaired a seam. Sometimes it was her humming by the fire. Sometimes it was a laugh low and surprised, a sound that did not belong to the land, but which now laid itself on the land like a second weather. He heard it even when she slept, her breath a map underneath the quilts. The sound made his chest tight in a way that was not pain. It was a tether. There were moments of fear that returned, small, nagging things. A wagon that creaked too close to the fence, the look of a stranger in the store that would not soften. Once, a boy in town threw a stone at the window of the cabin, and it shattered the quiet into a dish of glass. Naeli went to the window and set her hand on the pane where the stone had struck and did not cry out. She cleaned the glass, then she came to the ridge of the roof at dusk and, to Daniel's surprise, climbed up and half-smiled into the lowering sun. She sang then, a thread of notes without words, and the prairie took them and carried them farther than either of them had thought to send a sound. Daniel watched from below and felt something inside him rearrange, like a room being refurnished by time. Their marriage, the word had a strange weight now. To some in town it was an affront, to others a curiosity. To the two of them it was both a safety and a covenant. They had not sought legality as a loophole, though it had become one. They had sought a person to stay beside. There was a difference between being protected and being possessed, and both of them knew it. Naeli had not become a trophy. She remained a woman who mended moccasins, who kept watch at night, who could step forward and fire when a mob came to the door. Daniel had not become her savior. He had become the man who laid out his blanket and his roof when she had nowhere else that would not hunt her. Once, long after the men with their guns had moved on, Captain Hayes, a man who had been more curious than cruel, rode up alone and asked for a cup of coffee. He watched the way they moved about the cabin, the manner of domesticity that was both blunt and tender. He did not prattle about the law. He only said at last, as if he were stating a fact he had been slow to see, "You were both brave in your own way." Naeli did not look at him. She was boiling water for coffee on the small stove. She answered by lifting a lid and peering into the pot to judge whether it was ready. Her hands were the hands of someone who had mended and made and held much. "We do what is necessary," she said. When the captain left, the prairie wrapped its quiet around them again. There were nights when the wind came down cold off the high grass and whistled through the eaves. He would wake to find Naeli sitting by the door, her breath a white thread. She would look up and sometimes say one word in the thin English she had claimed. "Listen." The voice in the prairie had become a ritual between them. It was not the haunted echo of what she had once been, nor was it a promise that the world would be kind. It was, instead, a living thing that threaded their days and marked the border between what had been endured and what had been chosen. He remembered in the first days after he found her, thinking that perhaps the voice he heard at night was only his guilt making music. He had been alone so long that the presence of another human seemed to require repayment by constant vigilance. But the voice kept its own integrity. It changed tone over months. Where once it had been a tight line of sorrow, it began to hold more slack. A laugh, a snippet of a tune, the dry humor that sometimes uncoiled when she told him in halting phrases about a trick she had used once to free a trapped foot. He would lie under the rafters and let that sound wash over him, and he would feel, with the slow certainty of someone who had learned to read weather, that the prairie had altered its map. Neighbors came less often with their snarls. There were still sideways glances. There were still men who thought belonging in their town was a monopoly, and someone else's life a trespass. But the house had become a small place of argument turned to fact. The two of them ran the stove together. They took a single bed that sometimes complained of too many burdens. There was an economy to their days that made the world around them less easily able to grip them with fear. When harvests demanded help, people came and saw that life under that roof was not a scandal, but a kind of stubborn diligence. The town's opinion softened at the edges, because the math of it made no sense otherwise. This woman worked and paid for what she took. She made bread. She repaired harnesses with a steady hand. There is a kind of respect the frontier pays to competence, even when prejudice waits beneath the surface. They saved each other's life more than once, not always with rifles or words, but with the slow preservation of ordinary care. Once, after a fever took Daniel hard and left him a brittle shadow for a week, Naeli wrapped him in blankets and kept the fire hot and mended his shirts and sang to him the half-words she used when she couldn't sleep. He woke with the taste of coal in his mouth and found her asleep in the chair by the stove, the rifle across her knees. He saw then how the voice he had first heard was not only a sound made of memory, but an actual instrument of comfort. It soothed him like a hand pressed to a fevered brow. Their life was not a neat ending. It kept the shape of a frontier, wide, indifferent, dangerous. There would be other tests. A man once tried to buy her from a local merchant. A sordid offer she answered by folding up the letter and tucking it into the fire. Another time, a sheriff with old animosities came by and leaned his hat on the peg, then left when he saw the rifle in the set of Nally's jaw. Each test left them a little more settled, as if the world, forced to meet their quiet firmness, had no choice but to step around them. Every night, though, he returned to that simple ritual. He would sit on the low step outside the cabin, where the wind had a way of rewriting the grass's pattern into a language he was still learning. He would listen for the voice and feel it like a compass point. Sometimes it was literal. She would sing by the fire or speak to him in the small hours. Sometimes it was memory, the sound of her calling his name once in the dark, a syllable he had not expected to hear from another mouth. It made the prairie smaller in the best sense, a place with a center. On a night when the stars held themselves like a scattering of small silver coins and the air had the cool bite of early fall, Nayeli came to the door and stood with the dark behind her. She was wrapped in his blanket, the edge frayed from work and washing, and she smelled faintly of pine smoke and hot bread. Daniel sat on the step and watched how the light caught the line of her cheekbone. For a long time they did not speak. The land made its own noises, a coyote calling somewhere far off, the creak of an old fence post, the soft rustle of the grass. "It was not easy," Daniel said finally, not as a question, but as the plain accounting of truth. Nayeli's laugh came, low and surprised. "No," she answered, "but you kept the door. He turned to look at her then. Really look. And for a moment the years of the prairie and the weight of what had been done and what had been saved all boiled down to something that could fit into a single breath. She stepped up and put her hand into his. Her fingers fit his as if they'd been shaped for that exact joining. "You said once," she said, "that you heard my voice on the wind." "I did," he said. "Then hear it again," she told him. She breathed a note, small and unadorned, and the sound went across the grass and back. He felt it as an answering of something inside his chest. It was not only memory now. It was presence. Every night after that, when the wind came down from the high prairie, he would close his eyes and listen. Her voice would rise and fall, sometimes a song, sometimes a word. It threaded through the fences and the weather, and the town's slow,